Thanks very much for being here tonight. I'm really grateful for your interest in Guatemala and in this book. And I'd like to especially thank my editor, Jamie Rapp, who's sitting in the back, and also Marcy Posner, who's out there somewhere, and the folks from Warner's that really helped put this book together. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to see you here tonight. Can everyone hear me in the back?
You need to speak a little bit louder. You need to speak a little bit.
Shall I yell a little louder, or is the mic okay? Okay. Oh, there I go. Is this better? Okay. This is a picture of my husband, Efrain Bamaca Velazquez. I always knew him as Everardo, a commander of the Mayan resistance forces in Guatemala. The story is about him. The book is about him. But I hope as you read it and as you listen to me speak briefly tonight that you'll remember that this face is just one of 200,000 faces in Guatemala. 200,000 people that were dragged away, kidnapped by the Guatemalan army, secretly detained, tortured for a long period of time, and then tossed into an unmarked grave. This is the face of an XX. His body lies somewhere. The army doesn't care to say where, and it's one of 200,000 people that we need answers for, more answers than we have. I'm very lucky in many ways in that I'm alive to ask for answers, and also that I have the partial answers that I have been able to retrieve out of the files of the CIA, out of the files of the State Department, that I've been able to piece together at least some information. I have many women friends in Guatemala who to this day get up at 3 o'clock in the morning because they can't sleep and stand there ironing their husband's shirts. I have a friend in Chicago who still doesn't dare return to Guatemala to look for her two daughters, who would be in their 20s now. 15 years ago, she left home to do a few errands, and when she came home, the house was full of blood, wall to wall. Her husband and her father were missing, and so were her two infant daughters. Maybe they were killed with the father and husband. Maybe they were taken and sold into an illegal adoption ring. We don't know. She'd like some answers, and I think all of the Guatemalan families really deserve to know what became of their family members. Who was to blame? They deserve to be able to go to the courts and take these killers off the streets. So again, as you read this testimony that I've given in this book, just keep all of the others in mind and understand that this case is just symbolic. It represents all of the others. And it points out what needs to be done in our own country as well as in Guatemala. I guess tonight I'd just like to give a brief summary of what I know happened in this case and answer some questions and you know, talk about some of the issues afterwards, and rather than read from the book, because I think that all of you afterwards would be able to pick up the book and read for yourselves what my personal opinions were and what the personal relationship was about. What I know for certain happened to my husband is that he was captured alive by the Guatemalan army on March the 12th, 1992. He was literally taken in combat, taken alive. The army wanted to torture him for his information in private without the United Nations or the Red Cross or any other human rights groups causing any uproar about the Geneva Conventions. In order to torture him and break him in peace and quiet, they literally faked his death, saying that they had found his body after the combat and taken it to the nearby town of Retaluleo and buried him. They gave a perfect feature-by-feature description of this face, giving the correct age, the correct height, et cetera, saying this is the body we found after combat, this is the body we've buried. It was only after 10 months that a young prisoner of war was able to escape from a military base and say that's not true, it's all a hoax. The army is in fact torturing a selected out group of prisoners of war. Most are tortured and killed after a few days. All are killed eventually, but some are selected out for their special information. They're tortured for a long period of time in the hopes of breaking them and having them voluntarily work as secret informants for the army. That person's name was Santiago. He himself had been hung by his arms from a meat hook and beaten with cement blocks. He was beaten across the feet with a post until all of his toenails fell out. He was beaten with electrical shocks to the testicles. He was buried in a pit under an officer's desk. Literally, they rolled the desk back, rolled the carpet back, and there was a pit underneath. He was buried in another pit in a mountainside for a number of days. He was chained hands and feet to a bed with no blanket for 5 months. They came close to breaking him, but not quite. After that, he became a model prisoner. And on March the 12th, 1992, he in fact saw my husband dragged in and being subjected to the same sorts of abuse. One of the people in charge of his secret detention was Colonel Julio Roberto Alpires, a School of the Americas graduate. So was Major Sosa Orellana, another School of the Americas graduate. Towards the end of the summer, Santiago saw my husband strapped to a bed with an unidentified gas tank next to the bed. A physician had been called to stand by to make sure he wasn't accidentally killed during the torture session. He saw my husband swollen several times normal size, one arm and leg heavily bandaged as if they had ruptured or hemorrhaged, and he said he was speaking in a raving tone of voice. We know that he survived because Santiago saw him one more time, very ill, a few days later before he himself was able to escape and tell me what had happened. I then returned to Guatemala, opened the grave, and sure enough found that it was the wrong person. It's someone who looked nothing like my husband, was 15 years too young, 5 centimeters too short, with completely different dental records, and the original autopsy showed that the face was completely different and the scars were completely different. This confirmed that the Army had in fact carried out a hoax. Much later we learned that the person in the grave was in fact an 18-year-old soldier who had been tied up and beaten to death at the combat site as a decoy for my husband so that no one would know that he had been taken alive. As most of you know, I then carried out a whole series of hunger strikes to try to find out the truth about what had happened to my husband and to insist that he be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions together with any other secretly detained prisoners of any kind. At that point in Guatemala, all we knew is that in 35 years of civil war, in the prisons there were 0 surviving political prisoners. Amnesty had often been asked, why don't you do campaigns for political prisoners in Guatemala? Well, there weren't any. It was a non-survivable event to be captured alive by the Guatemalan army for political dissidents or for anything else. In all of those 35 years of civil war, 200,000 Guatemalans had been taken by the death squads and killed, a total that is higher than that of Argentina, Chile, and Salvador combined, and 440 Mayan villages had been wiped off the face of the map. At that point, I realized not only what had happened was exactly the way Santiago had said, but that my time was running out, that I didn't have a lot more time to save his life. So during my hunger strikes, I was asking that he be turned over to the courts together with anybody else, given a fair trial, and treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. In other words, not tortured, not secretly detained, given adequate medical care, and given any access to attorneys or human rights groups or families that he might need. That's the basic international law. It certainly is Guatemalan law as well. Of course, I went to the State Department many, many times. I was told again and again, we really don't know what happened to your husband. We're very concerned. We don't know what to do. We've asked the Army many, many times, and they say that they don't know, that they have never had your husband, and what else can we do? There's really no more that we can do for you. So in 1994, I started the hunger strike that many of you saw in the 60 Minutes broadcast, and I literally announced that my husband and I were a package deal. If nothing was going to be done for him, I was going on a hunger strike to the death, and that I didn't plan to leave the National Palace until something was done for him, or until I could find out the truth. The embassy did send someone to see me almost every day to check on my health, to check on my safety, and to tell me how upset they were and how they really didn't know what to do, that the Army had said they didn't have him, and what more could they do? Again and again, the same wording. Around day 30, when my hair was falling out and I was no longer able to keep my left eye open, when I was freezing cold sitting in the sunlight, when my blood sugar was dropping towards coma level, Mike Wallace came down from the 60 Minutes program and told me that, in fact, the embassy did know what had happened to my husband. They had a CIA report that said he was captured by the Guatemalan Army, that he was a secretly detained prisoner of war. Until then, the Army had been saying that maybe he'd run off with some other woman. Maybe that really was him buried in the first grave, but that since all Indians look alike, maybe I got confused. Apparently, the CIA bulletin informed the State Department that he was captured alive a long time earlier. At that point, the National Security Council also invited me to come to Washington and speak with them, which I did. I thought at that point that with this new disclosure and with the embassy admission that they did, in fact, have that CIA bulletin, that I would get somewhere, that I'd get some kind of assistance in saving his life. And instead, as soon as I was off the hunger strike, all doors closed again in Washington, and I could get nothing. I filed my Freedom of Information Act request. I got nothing, even though they were legally required to give my documents to me right away. I was granted expedited processing. So I went back on my hunger strike, this time in front of the White House, because it had become clear to me that the U.S. officials knew exactly what had happened to him, but wouldn't tell me, and that my time was completely up, my chance to save his life was completely gone and that I had to act immediately. And it was on day 12 that now Senator, then Congressman Torricelli came forward and told me, yes, your husband was ordered killed by Colonel Julio Roberto Alpérez, the same person named so long ago by the eyewitness in 1992. Not only that, but Colonel Julio Roberto Alpérez was a CIA asset, someone who was paid for giving information to the CIA. Since then, I sued the CIA and have pressed with my Freedom of Information Act with the other agencies, and I've gotten a lot of my files. And what I found is very shocking when you think back to what I'd been told from day one. First, it shows that, yes, my husband was captured alive on March the 12th, 1992, as we've all known from the beginning. It also shows that 6 days later, March the 18th, 1992, the CIA sent a bulletin to the White House and to the State Department. What did it say? Commander Everardo has been captured alive by the Guatemalan army. This is a very important capture. He has very special information. The army has not made his capture public and will probably fake his death to better take advantage of his situation. So in fact, they knew he was a prisoner the same week he was picked up. Did they know what would happen to a secretly detained prisoner of war? Yes, the files talk about prisoners being routinely thrown from helicopters. They talk about a nearby military base with a ring of pits around it filled so deep with water that when the prisoners were placed in them, they had to hang on to overhead bars to keep from drowning. They talk about prisoners being routinely offered a choice, work as secret spies for the army, or be summarily executed without a trial and thrown into an unmarked grave. They talk about Everardo not being buried in a freshwater well nearby, although a number of his friends have been thrown into that same well, including somebody that they named Chano, who's been disappeared for years. So they knew what would happen to Everardo as a secretly detained prisoner as well. Did they call the Red Cross? No. Did they call the United Nations? No. Did they report this to anybody? No. Did they know whose hands he was in? According to the Intelligence Oversight Board, they knew that he was being detained, or according to the Intelligence Oversight Board, he was being detained by more than one person on CIA payroll, more than one CIA paid informant. In other words, he was in the hands of people that worked for us. So yes, I think we knew exactly where he was. In July of 1992, the same month that Alpérez was seen bending over the torture table with a yellow pad in his hand, he received $44,000 from the CIA. I understand that the CIA is claiming that that was somehow some kind of severance pay from earlier on. I say tell it to the courts. I don't think it's legal to pay for information being extracted that we know is being extracted through torture, through secret imprisonment, and through assassination without trial. That can't be legal. If you can't receive stolen goods like a pair of candlesticks, surely you cannot pay for information being extracted through murder. Surely not. Not only did they know whose hands he was in, but when I went public in early 1993, one of the excuses I've heard for why I was not given the information is that different officials didn't know that those two names belonged to the same person. In fact, there's a March 1993 memo in the State Department files. Jennifer Harbury just called. She's an American citizen. She says she's married to Efrain Bamaca Velazquez, also known as Commander Everardo, both names spelled right, and says that he's being detained secretly by the Guatemalan army. So yes, they had both names. They told me they had no information. There's a heavily blacked out document that says a U.S. official, it doesn't say who, spoke with a number of Guatemalan military people. 3 military officials arrived. One of them said, yes, Everardo is still alive in captivity. The other 2 did not deny it. That didn't go to me. That did not go to Congress. And in fact, that may have been my last chance to save his life. They may have deprived me of my last chance to take him out of a torture cell. Later, when I was on my first hunger strike in front of the Politecnica in Guatemala with literally, people running around in the guard towers with submachine guns and death threats flying, at that point, another bulletin went from the Defense Intelligence Agency to the White House, to the State Department, and to the United States Embassy in Guatemala. It says, Bamaca was captured alive, he was interrogated many times, and then he was killed. Which means that all 3 of my hunger strikes, one of which lasted for 32 days, were for nothing. It means that my 3-year search was for nothing, that I could have known from the very beginning that there was no point pressing in anything except a court of law for murder charges, that I didn't need to go through the incredible acrobatics and risk that I had gone through to try to save his life. According to the files, we know also that Everardo was probably tortured for about a year. His suffering was long. We know that he was also interrogated many times and given drugs by Army physicians. We know that he was placed in a full body cast because he tried so often to escape. And that was their way of making sure that this treasure chest of information was not able to depart Army premises. We know that after a year they were very frustrated. They could not get any information from him if he spoke at all. He gave them disinformation. He was completely resistant to everything they tried. At one point he even offered to take them out to an arsenal, and he led a patrol into an ambush. I can only assume he was trying to get himself killed in the crossfire, which would have been his wish. Instead, a high-level military officer was not killed, but seriously wounded, and Alpérez and others, according to this document, requested permission to have him killed. That's where my trail ends. One report says that he was killed on the west coast and that he's buried under a military base called Las Cabañas with 500 to 2,000 other Guatemalans buried with him under this small base. When the special prosecutor tried to open that graveyard for me with court orders, we were turned away again and again. He was shot at and placed under death threats 24 hours a day, together with his son, until he finally resigned from office. On my first hunger strike, my Guatemalan attorney's office was bombed. Not long after the Torricelli disclosures, my lawyer in Washington had his car firebombed in his driveway in Washington, D.C. The church community, which has given me a room in Washington, D.C., was shot at the next day. It goes on and on. I received a call from the FBI not long after I testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee telling me that the generales down south were planning to hire a hitman to shoot me and that I better stay off the streets for a while. A human rights office that has given me the most support had its security gate literally torn off the hinges and left in the streets. The Guatemalan Army does not intend to take this case sitting down. Fortunately, it's been sent up to the Inter-American Court of the OAS for a full international trial that should happen at the end of this year. That's very historic. The Army has never before faced a court of law where the judges cannot be intimidated or shot. So hopefully, for once, we'll get an international condemnation in a case of disappearance, torture, and assassination. That's what I found in the files. That's a brief overview of what this case is about, how I met my husband, what our relationship was like, what it was like to search for him over and over throughout Guatemala under threats, throughout the United States, going to Geneva, going to the UN, is the story that's in the book, and I hope that the book is enlightening to you. What I'd like to do now is open the conversation to a question and answer session and see where we go from there. Yes?
I would like to ask you, I was reading in the docket of the Center for Constitutional Rights about your current cases. I wanted to find out what progress are you making in your civil suit against the State Department and the CIA and so forth.
There's three different cases. The question is that he has heard about my lawsuits in the Center for Constitutional Rights publications, and he wants to know how those are going. There are three different cases. The one against the Guatemalan Army has been brought in the Inter-American system, part of OAS, because it's impossible to get justice out of the court system in Guatemala, for the reasons that I've just been describing. That case has been sent from the commission level to the Inter-American Court level for an international trial, which is highly unusual, and I'm very pleased with that, for the reasons I explained. Against the United States government, I have two cases. One is against the CIA and recently other agencies to force them to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. I've given them my requests. I have some documents. I would like the rest. So far we have documents that say, yes, Everardo is a very exciting new prisoner, and then over here we have documents that say, oh yeah, he died a long time ago. Now, why do I suspect that something in the middle might be missing if we thought he was such an exciting prisoner and that his information was so valuable, and parentheses, he was in the hands of our paid assets? I think something's missing. Plus, a lot of the documents say secret at the top and the whole page is blacked out. Yes, I'm missing a few things. The other document, the other lawsuit against the United States government officials is a civil rights lawsuit based on a number of constitutional and federal issues. The lawsuit stems from two basic issues. One is his murder. He was killed by people on our payroll, people that were representing us, that were our agents. And the other is that I was deceived, I was lied to, and that the result of that misinformation may have been that I lost my last chance to save his life, first of all, and second of all, it threw me into incredible physical risks and emotional suffering. I was on these 3 hunger strikes. I was under constant death threats. I spent every day for 3 years thinking he was still in a torture chamber being torn apart when he wasn't, and when people knew that he wasn't. And I think it's time for these practices to come to an end. The Intelligence Oversight Board has found in its report that there have been general CIA practices to knowingly hire assets that they know are at that time engaged in the pattern and practice of heinous human rights abuses, torture, rape, kidnapping, murder. It also finds that families have not been properly given the information they have sought about their missing or dead relatives. And it also found that Congress was not properly informed of the real nature of the human rights violations in Guatemala. I would add that Guatemala has long since been labeled by Amnesty International as one of the worst human rights violators in the Western Hemisphere. Why wasn't Congress told? Yes.
Well, did your husband make you aware of the involvement of CIA, and had you any feeling of going forth while you were still with him to uncover the interaction of the CIA?
The question was, did my husband talk to me about the involvement of the CIA, and had I planned to go forth against the CIA at that time? My husband, when he first met me, thought I was probably a CIA agent. What else would I be? I was somewhat less than flattered by that. It's common knowledge in Guatemala and throughout Latin America that the CIA is deeply involved with repressive military regimes, starting with the Charles Horman case that became the subject of the movie Missing in Chile at the time of the stadium. Yes, North Americans were apparently present or nearby while he was being brutally interrogated and when he was eventually killed. The same for the murder and torture of the priest, Father Charney, in Honduras. Sister Diana Ortiz, who was gang raped and incredibly, horribly tortured in Guatemala, was taken out of there by an American citizen, a tall, fair-haired, fair-coloring man who spoke perfect American English and awful Spanish, knew where the house was where she was being tortured, was able to just walk in and had the authority to say, hey, you guys, give her to me. She's a U.S. citizen. He walked out with her and left all of the Guatemalans on the floor to die and never reported it. And she's been listed as perhaps crazy for having tried to tell this story. Since Diana Ortiz's story, I've had a number of people come to me and say, well, yes, when I was being tortured, a North American came in. I couldn't see him because I was blindfolded. Well, how did you know he was a North American? Well, I lived in the United States for 12 years, and I know an American accent when I hear it. Good enough. What about the two of you guys? Well, we used to drive by all the time to this house where the gringos were, and the boss stopped and checked in. These people who literally worked with the security forces and knew a lot about human rights violations. Apparently, it was common, and people are just now starting to find the courage to come forward and talk about these things. As torture survivors, they know that life can be tenuous if one tends to talk, but they are starting to come forward. At the time I was married to him, no, I didn't know very much about the CIA. I knew what everybody had told me, and you sort of know it, but you can't prove it, and you don't have anything concrete. So my thought was more, let's do something about human rights. Let's keep the refugees safe. Let's not let immigration send them back to Guatemala where they'll get massacred again. That was my intent at that point. And when I found out that he was in the hands of the army, my intent was to get him out of those hands as fast as possible. Now my intent is to see that both governments, Guatemalan and U.S., don't continue with these practices that end up in genocidal campaigns. Yes?
Did Clinton in the last year or so, or 2 years ago, say at a press conference to a reporter to you that he's going to get to the bottom of your case and let you know exactly what happened to your husband? And it seems peculiar to me, Torricelli never says a word about this case any longer. He is completely quiet. I don't know if that is so or it's just my imagination.
Actually, Senator Torricelli, now Senator, has been very active and very, very progressive on Guatemala always, and in fact just did a taping with me on the Charlie Rose show, which I hope you'll see. I'm very sorry that the senator didn't get more support out of this very conservative House because he did something very heroic. Anyone that discloses corruption or misconduct on the part of U.S. officials needs to get an award, because if that isn't disclosed, how do we taxpayers find out what's going on? None of us knew that our tax dollars were going to pay the salaries of torturers. Maybe some of us suspected it, but most of us did not know it. And we wouldn't know it if it hadn't been for him. And also the same goes for Mr. Nuccio, who very bravely came forward to Mr. Torricelli. You know, we really need to applaud the whistleblowers at all times.
And President Clinton is
I've never heard a word from President Clinton on this case. I've gotten no promises from him whatsoever, no communications whatsoever, and I'm very upset right now because the Truth Commission goes into operation in Guatemala in 2 weeks. They have a 6-month mandate, and our government has not opened one single human rights file to give to them. In other words, we have evidence, critical evidence, about human rights crimes like torture, like mass rape, like genocide, like massacres of villages in our files, and we won't even give it to the courts or to the Truth Commission that is set up to resolve these issues in Guatemala so that peace can go forward. And I really feel like the Guatemalan families have the right to know what happened. I'll be seeing some friends in another country very soon who have 17 people in their family disappeared, including all younger brothers and sisters. And I think they have a right to know. They can't be whole until they get the truth. Yes?
Have you thought, or has anybody thought of getting on the internet and getting thousands of people to clog the White House mail and clog all of the agency's mail so that they will know that there's a constituency out there that wants the information to get out?
In fact, one of the reasons I'm still walking around in one piece is because that's exactly what happened during my very long hunger strike. I was writing letters back to our fax tree. You know, I'd sort of composed this awkward fax tree of friends across the country that had offered to help. And someone very wisely started putting it on internet every 2 days. And the result was, you know, we had called for everyone to call a White House comments line to talk to Clinton because we'd been told that if 30 calls come in a given day, a note goes to Clinton's desk saying this is a matter of public interest. Even before the 60 Minutes broadcast, Clinton was getting over 100 calls a day. You know, like too loud, very loud. And after the 60 Minutes report, it apparently went off the Richter scale, which is why I got at least as much as I did get, and which is why this campaign is really beginning to take off. We will be hoping to get a bill passed or a bill presented on the floor of Congress very soon requiring these files to be open with the obvious, you know, exceptions for national security, you know, protection of informants and stuff. We don't want to cause a bloodbath, but, you know, at least for the underlying facts and at least the key people to be named for the Truth Commission. And that will go out on internet, and we will need your help in calling one by one the people on the appropriate committees and stuff. Yes?
Yeah. I'd like to ask you 2 quick questions. You mentioned that Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes gave you the initial break while you're on the first hunger strike, for the initial crack in the story that they did know he was captured alive. I wonder if you could maybe either comment or speculate even on why you think he may have done that, or what were his motivations for doing that. Was it possibly to get you off the hunger strike or something? Second question, I know you said it's discussed in the book, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what your life together with Everardo was like during the couple years or so that you were together before he was captured.
Well, the first question was, you know, why did Mike Wallace break this story? Well, before I started my hunger strike, I thought that I might very well end up in a hospital unable to speak. You know, I didn't know what was going to happen. I hoped that the Guatemalan army would not be able to take the political heat of Mike going into convulsions on their front lawn. I hoped. I mean, it was a little bit of political pressure, but I didn't know. So I took the precaution and wrote up a 32-page document citing every single thing that I'd done and all the facts and all the documents that I had. On the plane down, he read that, and in his other hand, he had what he already knew, which is that the State Department was not telling me the truth. They did know what had happened to him. They did know that he'd been captured alive, and they were refusing to help me or him. So when he actually got out to see me, I hadn't been eating for more than 20 days by then, and he was very angry. And he did his show because it was the right thing to do. He was blowing the whistle on governmental misconduct. In the process, the side effect was that it probably saved my life or saved me from very irreversible physical harm, for which I'm extremely grateful. For the same reason, I'm very grateful to Senator Torricelli. Your second question is, what was it like for us to live together? Well, we only were able to live together in Mexico City. He was up for the year. He was up out of combat because he'd been called to work on the peace negotiations. The next issue on the agenda, they were signing agenda issue by issue, And then finally, the final peace accords years later. The next issue was indigenous rights. He was a Mayan peasant who grew up starving on a plantation. His first language was Mam. His second language was Quiche, and he learned to read and write in the mountains. They thought he might be qualified to speak for the Mayan peasants. And he spent most of the year there, and we lived together for most of that year. We were underground. What can I say? We lived in a house where neither of our names were on any papers. There was no telephone. We had to be very careful coming in and out. We had to make very certain that we were never followed. If he didn't show up at a certain time, I had secret numbers I had to call. I mean, it was very, very difficult and dangerous, but he was worth it. Yes?
What can you expect out of this OAS court? From my perspective, they probably don't have any power to get any testimony or get any papers. They probably don't have any power to enforce. Is that true, or what can you expect from them?
They don't have to get anything. I already got it for them the hard way. We have the CIA files. We have more than one eyewitness now. We have, in fact, 3 eyewitnesses, 2 of whom have already given their testimony, and the 3rd who will in a short period of time. We have more evidence, I think, than any court of law could possibly use. That's not the problem. They cannot throw anyone in jail. They don't have those powers. It's a civil case, which means it is for money damages. Can they force the government to pay money damages? They probably can't force them, but the consequences is that Guatemala, now trying to start over and say, we're a new and improved Guatemala under the peace accords, we're really good guys now, throw us some money, instead would get kicked out of the Organization of American States. It would be like being, thrown out of the United Nations. They really would have to comply with any final decisions of OAS or become a pariah state, just as they're trying to turn the corner and make improvements. So they will comply, and I think it's the best thing that could happen to the Army. They've never been taken to bat for one single one of these 200,000 tortures and murders. There has to be a first time, because otherwise these killers continue to walk the streets thinking, no big deal, it's a freebie, which means that there'll be another 200,000 people dead pretty soon and another 35-year war. There has to be a way to press for civil reform without literally getting your hand sawed off, right? Yes.
How is your health now?
Seems pretty good. It's been 2 years since those strikes. I'm not as strong as I was. I used to, do karate and lift weights and stuff, and was a lot more fit than I am now. I get tired more easily. My hair is growing back in. It all fell out for a while, but it's coming back. I'm in surprisingly good shape for what happened and how close a call we had there on the very long one. Who hasn't added a question yet, and then I'll come back to you folks. Yeah.
There's a father bourgeois who has campaigned long and hard against or for the closing of the School of the Americas, where many of the citizens of Latin American countries are trained to murder and torture their people. I'm sure you must be supportive of that. And do you think that there's a possibility of all of this coming together at some point? Your own campaign and the bourgeois?
Well, in fact, we've come together on a number of different occasions. Our campaigns cross all the time because Colonel Julio Roberto Alpérez was a School of the Americas graduate. So was Major Sosa Orellana. Both of them were, and both of them are very deeply implicated in my husband's secret detention, long-term torture, and eventual murder. So we have, in 1992, after the Berlin Wall went down, 2 School of the Americas graduates torturing a prisoner of war to death in a secret prison in violation of every international statute you can think of and every international treaty possible. Just by way of background to answer your question, the School of the Americas is a military training center. Numerous people are trained there from Latin America. For some strange reason, an enormous percentage of the graduates, compared to any other military school, relatively speaking to every other military school in the United States, for some reason a very disproportionately large number of School of the Americas graduates end up being the worst human rights violators anywhere. In Salvador we have, serious implications to a School of the Americas graduate, for example, in the killing of Archbishop Romero, a pretty serious murder. That would be one example. Similarly, in the case of Sister Diana Ortiz. For those of you not familiar with her case, she was a young nun who was working in Guatemala with school children. She was dragged through a convent hedge taken to a secret detention center, gang raped, and then lowered into a pit filled with dying people and rats. And when she was taken out, she had more than 110 cigarette burns on her back, not counting the rest of her body. I need not go into the rest of what happened to her. The Minister of Defense at the time that happened, who made numerous comments about how crazy Diana must be and how that could never have happened, is a School of the Americas graduate. Do we really need to turn these people out of our military educational center? And if this center is producing this kind of person, shouldn't this place be shut down? I mean, what exactly kind of evil forces are we setting loose on our neighbors in Latin America? I often hear, well, it's not our fault. You know, any school could turn out a few bad apples. But if none of the other schools turn out anywhere near that many bad apples or anywhere near that bad a kind of apple, then it's scientifically impossible that that's just a coincidence year in and year out. They are doing something. And as you've all heard, the manuals that were found in Spanish from the 80s in the School of the Americas do talk about very serious sorts of human rights violation. So it isn't people's imaginations. And I hope that the school is closed down very quickly. Yes?
What is the similarity between Guatemala and what has happened in Chiapas in Mexico?
I think they're very, very similar. Probably many of you know Chiapas was once part of Guatemala. You know, both are indigenous regions. They're both Mayan regions. Both areas have the majority being Mayans who have been completely dispossessed by the direct descendants of the Spanish conquistadors. They now, although they're the majority, they have no land, they have no political power, they have no rights. They're very much looked down on. I'm consistently asked in Guatemala, how could it be possible that a white woman with a Harvard law degree could have married someone so dark with such thick lips? It's like, what can I say? I'm speechless. Beats me. They're faced with this incredible racism. They're faced with a really crushing poverty level. 80% of the Mayans in Guatemala suffer from severe malnutrition. I'm 5'3", I'm taller than the average man in most of the rural areas in Guatemala. There's an 80% illiteracy rate. Their culture is not respected. They speak their own Mayan languages. They're beaten in the army and at the schools into learning Spanish and trying to assimilate as best they can. And not surprisingly, there tend to be uprisings. In Guatemala, there's been a peasant Mayan uprising every single generation for 500 years. You know, they pick up machetes, rocks, bows and arrows, anything they can do. One of the most interesting battles that my husband's unit fought was when someone remembered during a very difficult time an old fortress built by the ancient Mayans where they'd fought the conquistadors way, way up in a mountain pass, and they literally fled to that place and defended themselves against the Guatemalan army there, sort of rebattling a historic war from 5 centuries earlier. It worked really well. It was a good fortress. They lived that day. So I think that the best way to summarize both Chiapas and Guatemala is a poster I once saw in a refugee center, and it shows someone who looks a lot like this with a bullet band around his waist, and underneath it says, people get cranky when they're hungry.
Shall we take one more question?
Sure. Yes.
I wonder if you have any up-to-date information on the case about Michael Devine, and do you know how his wife's case is going? She's still in Guatemala.
I hear that off and on Carol Devine is still in Guatemala. I'm hesitant a little to talk about her case because I'm not well informed. You know, I can only talk about scraps of information I've heard, which is not the right way to talk about a legal situation. I know that her husband, Michael Devine, and she had lived in Guatemala for many, many years on a small farm they'd bought. They were very respected by the local community and well-liked. He just was picked up by several soldiers and literally tortured and left almost decapitated one night with no explicable reason. Later, after Senator Torricelli came out with the disclosures, it became clear that Alpedras had had something to do with this. He was, you know, locally in charge of the military base and stuff. There had been enough links between him and the death of Devine that it was looked into by the Department of Justice under the terrorist statute. For some reason, Carol Devine was never informed of any of this, and I would like to know why. Why not? I'm sorry, those were the end of the questions, but if anybody wants more information about Guatemala, I'd recommend that you link with your local Amnesty chapter. Amnesty's been very, very helpful to me, or you can call the Guatemala Human Rights Commission in Washington. That number is 202-529-6599. We're going to be starting a campaign to insist that the files on the disappeared be open so that the Guatemalans can know what happened to their family members and so that we can know what our government is doing with our tax dollars, and we'll need your help. That campaign will be on internet, and you can find out about it through either one of those two organizations. No, I don't, but it's 202-529-6599. That's all I got, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Ask her if she knows it. Thank you.